Hey, welcome to the seventh professor's lecture of the course Social Work 422, Families in Stress. So we are now at the midterm point, and so you really need to be thinking about taking the midterm. It's open from the 15th to the 18th. You will have 3 days to take it. It opens at 12:01 a.m. on the 15th and closes at midnight on the 18th. And so you need to take it between those times. Maybe you've already taken it, so don't even worry about this. If you haven't, now's the time to do it. Remember that the midterm exam is based on the questions asked thus far, plus there's one extra essay question to give some of those of you who think that way an opportunity to make more points. You will need to, it's an 8-point essay question, so it's pretty significant. You will need to study from the study guide, which is at the bottom of the Moodle. So if you scroll all the way down, there's a place for midterms past module 11. So now we're going to move into another model. And now keep in mind that all these models build on each other. They're kind of sequential. And so you've got the early models that led to the ABCX model. The ABCX model led to the double ABCX model. The double ABCX model led to the FAAR, FAR model, and now that has led us to the typology model of family adjustment and adaptation. Be sure before you take the quiz on this, you probably should have already done it even before listening to this lecture, you read the book, okay, the text, Weber's Individuals and Families in Stress and Crisis, chapter 7. However, this model's kind of cool, because it starts to take us to a place where we can actually do some practice interventions based on the model. So instead of just being entirely theoretical, this is something we can do something with a little bit. We'll get even better as time goes on. We've got 8, 9, 10, and 11 forthcoming, and in those there's some more opportunities to learn about models that have interventions attached to them. So 8 is the resiliency model, 9 is the family distress model, 10 is the, we start to talk about crisis management, and then 11, we talk about the practice of crisis management. And so we are building up to a place where you have something to do with all this, some interventions that can come out of it. So I hope you're getting excited about this. It's really teaching a lot about how individuals and families go into stress, experience stress, and then go into crisis. In this model, we're going to add a few things. So let's move on to the next slide and introduce the module. So the typology family, a model of family adjustment and adaptation. Notice that there's adjustment and adaptation like the FAR model. So obviously this is going to build on the FAR model. Adds family types to the double ABCX and FAR models. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. I'll show you a diagram to explain what we're talking about, and then we'll go into that further in a few moments. It addresses family functioning as buffers or protective devices against dysfunction, and it addresses family functioning as a target for change, something that we can do to help the family by kind of understanding how they're responding to stress and crisis. This can serve as a guide for us when it comes to doing practice. Now, with that in mind, let's move on to the conceptual framework, starting with the first of the two phases, the adjustment phase. Just like with the FAR model, there's an adjustment phase and an adaptation phase. So we're going to start with the adjustment phase. Next slide. Notice at the top right, we have a series of letters, A, V, T, and then at the top C, bottom B, then to the right PSC, and then X, which we know stands for crisis. Okay, so this is the first half. You'll notice that in the adaptation phase, which comes next, it begins with the X, the crisis, and then moves into the second half, the adjustment phase. Now, what do these A, B, C, PSC, V, and T factors stand for? Well, the A is the stressor event or life transition. Now, remember that the family life cycle model posits that people move through life. There's single, unattached young adults, then there's couples that are, cohabiting or living together or married in some, married or common law marriage or some other arrangement. And then that couple adds members to the family through adoption or through birth. So then they have the entrance of new family members, and then there's another stage of families with adolescence, which is a turbulent period in and of itself. Then launching kids out into the world. Now the family's beginning to move towards empty nesters, then the family in middle age, then the family in older age, and then the cycle begins again with the children's generation. Each of those points can be very stressful for a family. So when it talks about stress or transition, they're talking about these kind of life transitions. And other kinds of life transitions are like entering college, taking on a new job, getting a promotion, those kinds of things. All those transitions are stressful. So A stands for a stressful event or a stressor, and then it could also stand for a transition, but it stands also for the level of severity. Now remember, not all stresses are equally severe. If someone has $100,000 in the bank and needs a $5,000 car repair, it's stressful, but it's not catastrophic. If, on the other hand, somebody has $1,000 in the bank and needs a $5,000 car repair, that's stressful. And so the severity is significantly higher. I hope that makes sense. That's an easy example. B is the family's resistance resources. What do they have that can help them fight against, resist the stress becoming crisis? C is the appraisal the family makes of the event, the meaning that they give to it. Remember the $100,000 and the $1,000 example? Well, the meaning would be very different, wouldn't it, of those two examples? The family would appraise the family with $100,000 would appraise the $5,000 stressor as stressful, but we can deal with it. The person with $1,000, it's like, oh my gosh, now what do I do? How do I get to work? How do I take the kids to school? How do I go grocery shopping? This is pretty major for them, right? So the C is their meaning making of the stressor or their appraisal. PSC stands for just what it looks like. Problem, P, S, solving, C, coping. The family's problem solving and coping resources. And those are both internal and external. You know, we can cope with our own individual resources, our togetherness, our love for each other, or maybe I'm been hacked and my son is a computer guru, or we each bring our individual resources and our collective resources within the family, but then there's also external help as well. Things like friends, family, church, neighbors, etc., that can help us from the outside, okay? V is the family's vulnerability. So how vulnerable are they to a pileup of demands? And then T is the type of family, which is what we're going to move into next. There's regenerative, resilient, rhythmic, balanced families, etc. We're going to study those in the next few slides. Now, what I want you to watch for is on the upper right-hand corner in this diagram, you're going to see circles appear around each of those in the next few slides, and then arrows pointing to the bigger diagram as to where each of these are found. So keep your eyes peeled. Here we go. Next slide. There it is. See the circle and see the arrows? The A refers to the stressor or the life transition, and the level of severity helps determine the amount of stress experienced by the family. Think about the threat or the disruption to the family. Think about how much it taxes or uses up the family's resources. So you can see that A there, with the circle around it, is pointing to the phase of the adjustment, the diagram of the adjustment phase, and it's pointing to stressors and transitions, right? So that's the A. Now moving on to the V. Next slide. There's the circle around the V, and it's pointing to vulnerability. Now V is the family's vulnerability. It's the pileup of stress. Look to the left, you'll see the word pileup. So the stress, strains, transitions, and then the next circle to the right is the demands they make on the family. All of these come together to interact with the family's vulnerability. If the family's not all that vulnerable, then they'll adapt or adjust to the stress quite well. If the family's highly vulnerable, this family system's highly vulnerable, then they will not adapt well. Okay, so now we're working through the diagram. We're going to move to the T. Next slide. The T refers to family type. So you notice the next box, we've got the pileup, we've got the demands, we've got the vulnerability, now we've got the family type. The family type is how the family operates. And there's 4 main types that we'll go into in a minute. Excuse me. Regenerative, resilient, rhythmic, and traditionalistic. There's 2 levels. You'll see what this means in a minute, high and low, and 2 dimensions, which you'll see in the next minute, in the next slide. So let's move on to that and look at the different family types. Now keep in mind, this is what this model brings that's unique and new and special and helpful to us as social workers. Okay, moving on. So here we're still in the adjustment phase. We have the 4 main family types. If you'll notice the titles at the very top of each of these types, typology of regenerative families. And the next one to the right is a typology of resilient families. Then to the lower left, the typology of rhythmic families. And then to the lower right, the typology of traditionalistic families. All right? Now, with that in mind, we're going to, in a second, turn to each of these and look at them in detail. But before we do that, I want you to see that let's start with the regenerative families. There's actually 4 subtypes of regenerative families: vulnerable, secure, durable, and regenerative. Now, these are based on 2 factors. One, look to the left-hand side, family coherence. Then, look to the top, family hardiness. So you'll see how each of these has a couple words to the left and then some words at the top, and the words low and high. So if you look to the left one again, regenerative families, you've got families with high coherence and families with low coherence. And then at the top you have hardiness, families with low hardiness and families with high hardiness. So for example, a durable family would be a family with high coherence, they're together, but low hardiness, low internal strength. Whereas if you look at a secure family, the top right, they've got high hardiness, the ability to fight through stuff, but low coherence. They're not really as organized as they could be. So now you see the 2 factors of each of the 4 subtypes. So let's look in more detail at these in the next few slides. Next slide, please. Still in the adjustment phase, still on the typology, the family types, and now we're going to look specifically at regenerative families. Now, regenerative families have 2 dimensions. Hardiness, which is the sense of control and meaningfulness and involvement in activities, commitment to new experiences. These are tough families. And then there's on the left, dimension of coherence. This is acceptance, loyalty, pride, faith, trust, respect, caring, shared values. So you'll notice that families can either be low or high on coherence or low and high on hardiness. So a vulnerable family has low hardiness and low coherence. That's what makes them vulnerable, right? A durable family has low hardiness but high coherence. So they have a low sense of control but a high togetherness. A secure family has high hardiness, strong sense of control and meaningfulness, but low coherence, which means they're not working together well, and these other values of coherence are not as evident. And then finally, a regenerative family, which is probably, of all these types of regenerative families, what we would like to be, is one with both high hardiness and high coherence, which means they're going to deal with stress a little bit better, a little bit differently, and probably more proactively, positively than other families. Okay, let's now move to the typology of resistant families. Still under, so we've still got the T circled here, but now we're talking about resilient families, I'm sorry. They have 2 dimensions: bonding which means they're open to discussion. They feel close. They desire connection, and they like doing things together. The other dimension is flexibility. It means they have open communication. They know how to compromise. They're willing to shift and adapt responsibilities to meet needs. For example, if the stressor is going off to military service and the husband has always washed the car, then the oldest daughter may step up and wash the car, shifting responsibilities, right? And then a willingness to share decision making. So bonding and flexibility are the two dimensions of resilient families. Now, there's 4 family subtypes. The fragile family has low flexibility and low bonding. The pliant family, highly flexible, but low bonding. Bonded families have low flexibility, so they're a little bit more rigid. They don't flex as well, but they're strong and together, high bonding. And then a resilient family is very flexible and highly adaptable to bonding. So they're open to discussion, they feel close, they desire connection. Meanwhile, they have open communication, compromise, and willingness to shift responsibilities, etc. So this is the family that we would want, the direction that we would want to move families. So we'd want to move pliant families to the right, fragile families down and to the right, bonded families down. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Okay, now let's move to the typology of rhythmic families. Rhythmic families also have 2 dimensions, as do they all. Rhythmic families are all about family rhythms, routines, time, right? So time and routines means they promote parent, child, husband and wife, and family and relative togetherness. They set out time for these things. They have routines to make them happen. They go to each other's games or come to hear the husband speak or support the wife as she rides in her Mardi Gras parade. You see what I'm saying? So the parents are involved with the children, husband's involved with the wife, and then families are involved with their relatives. They go to relatives' houses to celebrate events or just to hang out. There's a lot of togetherness outside of the family with other relatives. A second dimension is valuing. So this is the degree to which they value time, they value routines. In other words, I could really value family togetherness with my extended family, but not take the time to do it, right? We don't have a routine of doing it. So that would be the difference between the two. So an unpatterned family has low family time and routines, and they don't really value family time and routines. So they don't value it, they don't do it. A structuralized family has high family time, they spend time together, high family routines, but don't really value it. So they do it, but it's just not a value of the family. An intentional family has low family time and routines, but they do really value family time and routines. Maybe they're too busy to do it, right? The kids are in extracurricular activities, the parents are involved at work, then they have church, and they got other stuff going on, social aid and pleasure clubs, they've got their Rotary Club or their Lions Club meetings, et cetera, and they just don't have time to spend together. Now, a rhythmic family, I wish I had spelled that a little bit better, but rhythmic families have both high family time and routines, and they really value it. So they want to spend time together, and they make it happen. This leads us to the final typology, which is traditionalistic families. Now, traditionalistic families also have, like all the others, 2 dimensions. These are families about celebrations and traditions. Now, when we say celebrations, we mean birthday parties, special occasions, holidays, anniversaries, etc. The traditions are things like holiday decorating, special experiences around changes, like changing from 8th grade to high school, from high school to college, or high school to the military, graduation of high school. So they celebrate those experiences, make time for them. They have special rules for religious occasions, like going to church on Easter or a bar mitzvah, right? And then they have kind of traditional expectations for who gets to participate in each occasion. Who decorates the tree? Who puts up the Christmas lights? Who plans the party, et cetera, et cetera. So there's 4 subtypes of families in the traditionalist routine, or traditionalist families. Situational, so low celebrations. They don't celebrate much in low tradition. They don't have many traditions. We think maybe a Jehovah's Witness family who doesn't really celebrate holidays and doesn't value holidays might fit in that type of family. Celebratory families who have high celebrations, so they love to celebrate, but they're not much for tradition. Traditionalistic families have low celebrations, but lots of traditions. And then ritualistic families are both high in the celebrations and high in the traditions. And so they love to party, and so they create opportunities to do so. They're looking forward to Mardi Gras, then they're looking forward to Lent, then they're looking forward to Easter, then and so on and so forth. They're kind of following the traditions of their particular way of doing things. So these are the family typologies, or the T of the diagram. This is what's really new and special about this diagram. Now, let's move to the B. Next slide. So the B, as you can see, is resources. These specifically are family resources, resources within the family. Family resources help the family adjust to stress and resist the onset of crises. Now, resources are not always tangible resources like money or things, right? But sometimes they can be intangibles like strengths, knowledge, abilities, even spiritual resources that are a little bit more intangible. Resources include things like family strengths, but also family rituals and family routines. Rituals and routines can help buffer against the onslaught of stressors. For example, Christmas is stressful, but a family who loves to celebrate and loves Christmas is going to engage in celebrating Christmas no matter what's happening, right? They may celebrate it a little differently because they're going through some challenges, but they're going to celebrate it. So those are how the importance of family routines and family rituals. So in the next slide, we're going to turn to the top of the diagram, or the C, the family appraisal. Let's move on. The family appraisal is the way the family defines or makes meaning of the stressor. So families see stressors as crises or as challenges and opportunities. So the family is constantly giving meaning to the seriousness of the stressor. Remember the $100,000 versus the $1,000 bank account. For one family, it's much more serious than for the other family. They're also thinking about the hardships that the stressor is going to cause. So now I've got to take out a loan to pay for this, car repair, and that's going to cause a lot of hardships for the family. We have to tighten up a little bit and stop doing things we were doing before that cost money. And then they're also thinking about, in terms of meaning, the stressor's effect on the family. What impact will this have on our ability to function? In the next slide, we are going to turn to the PSC, which is the problem solving and coping. So let's move ahead. Problem solving is the family's skill at defining the stressor as manageable, at the same time identifying steps to deal with it, and then implementing those steps and doing something about it. Now, there's 3 ways that families do this. One is avoidance. Avoidance is the effort to deny or ignore the stressor and ignore or deny the demands it has on the family, just out of sight, out of mind. Elimination is an effort to rid the self or rid the family of the stressor by either changing or removing the stressor, or changing the definition of the stressor. One time I had a group of people volunteers doing door-to-door surveying. And I told them to knock on every door of the neighborhood. And they knocked on one door of a house that looked pretty burned down and assumed that nobody would come to the door. And just as they were walking away, they heard the door open, and they looked and they saw a woman inside, and they said, "Oh, we thought nobody lived here." And she said, "Oh, no, I live here." And she had had her house burned down by some addicts who were dealing out of the side of the house and had lit the house on fire, but she didn't want to move out. And the kids were all like, the volunteers were all like, "Oh my gosh, this is horrible. I couldn't live in a burned down house. How does she do it? This is a terrible situation." And she was like, you know, "I love life. I love my neighborhood. I'm going to get over this. I'll be all right. God will take care of me." And so she gave a very different meaning to that stress-filled, potentially crisis-filled event than did the volunteers who were surveying her. So that would be changing the definition of the stressor, right? So they either change or remove the stressor itself or change its definition when they do elimination. Finally, assimilation. Assimilation is accepting the demands created by the stressor and making minor changes in the family to deal with the stressor. So these are three strategies, according to this typology model, that are used to cope with problems or cope with stressors in the family. So next slide, we move just one step forward. X stands for maladjustment, so they don't adjust well, and maladjustment moves them to crisis. Now, when we talk about crisis here, we're talking about a family that cannot meet the demands of the stressor. And so they just kind of, they fall apart, right? They become disorganized. And they need to make change. This stressor is demanding that they make family changes, but the change being required of them upsets the balance of the family and creates a crisis. Maybe the kids don't want to do something different. Maybe the wife, the husband don't want to do things differently, but they have to adjust to this crisis. And so there's negative feelings and discomfort. And so the family then either has to kind of cycle back through all these steps of the adjustment phase, or they just reach the point of exhaustion and essentially give up. So now we've moved through the adjustment phase. We're going to take it then the next step over. So if you picture this, us moving from A to X, now the adjustment of the adaptation phase is going to take us from X further on. So let's move to the adaptation phase next. Now this is a little bit more of a complicated diagram. You notice the X at the left, that's the same X as we had before, right? The crisis, the maladjustment. But now they're moving into adaptation. So they're not just adjusting to the stress, now they're going to do something about it. Now there's several letters here, and I'm just going to walk through them with you really quickly. Double X is the level of family adaptation at the end. Double A is a pileup of demands on the family system that are created by these crises, transitions, and strains. We'll go into these in more detail in a second. R is the family's level of regenerativity, their ability to bounce back, their ability to re-energize themselves, their ability to respond, which is determined in large part by the pileup of demands. T is the family typology that we've talked about already. Double B is the family strength, their internal strengths, ability to adapt, their capability, their resources. Double C is the family's appraisal or meaning of the situation in the adaptation phase. Triple C is the family's schema or their worldview, which shapes their appraisal or meaning. For example, if it's a strongly religious family, they may say this is God's will, we can handle this, God will give us nothing more than we can handle. Versus if they come from a kind of more fatalistic family, they're like, oh my God, this is just, the other shoe keeps dropping, we're never going to get past this, oh my God, this is terrible, right? So they could, their worldview could dictate how they appraise a situation. Triple B is the family supports from outside the family, from friends, community. It's the social supports, right? And then the PSC is again the problem solving and coping resources. So watch the little circles across the top as we move through each of these in the next diagram and the next slide. Okay, so here we have the X. We've already talked about this. This is the same X as before. It's the situational or the situation or the transitional crisis. Remember, crises can be individual stressors or it could be transitions in the family life cycle. That moves us to the B. Okay, so the double A then, you see the circle around the double A, and then you see the arrow from double A over to pileup. The double A is the pileup. It's the things that are going on right now, but also the prior stressors, the prior strains, the prior transitions, and the prior demands. These are all the elements that are adding up, piling up on the person and on the family, right? Next slide, please. Moving up to the R, we see that the R in this diagram is the family's regenerativity. It's either high or low. They're able to adapt to this and heal from it and recoup their losses and move on, regenerate, right? Or if they don't regenerate, if they have low regenerativity, then this stuff's going to impact them even more because now their resources are tapped and they're tired and they just don't have much to go on. This leads us then to the next piece, which is the family type. Next slide. So I guess I don't need to go back into the different family types, but think about, as these families are trying to adapt now, they've tried to adjust, now they're trying to adapt and change things. As they try to adapt, different family types adapt in different ways. I'm not going to go back through all the family types again. We've already done that. But you see how the family type then determines what happens next. So what happens next is going to be, what we're going to look at next is going to be the resources of the double B. So let's move on. So the double B at the bottom of this loop here are the family resources. They're the family's characteristics, what they're all about, their traits, and their competencies or abilities. And those may be tangible, as we've talked about, or intangible. They may be personal, because individual members of the family have strengths, resources, competencies, characteristics that they can bring to the table. My son, for example, just extremely mellow, hang loose. We were visiting with him in Christmas time, and he had a car accident on his way to his engagement party with all of us in the car, and he's like, it's cool, we'll get through it, no big deal. I mean, he's just mellow. That is an amazing characteristic to bring to a family to help them cope with stress. I, on the other hand, am, when there's a stress, I just get very organized, very focused, and I get things done. I'm not always mellow about it, but I figure out a plan and stick to that plan. My wife takes care of the emotional needs of the family in the midst of all this, and so on and so forth, right? My two daughters do other things. And so all of us bring pieces of ourselves, but we also bring resources of the entire family together. When we're together, remember, there's a gestalt that happens. A whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so we bring all of our capacities together, and we pull together as a family to deal with the crisis. So that's the double B. Move on to the next slide, please. The triple B, which you can see is feeding into the double B, is community supports. Now, community supports can be people, they can be groups, or they can be institutions outside the family. At the meso level, we're talking about things like school, church, synagogue, mosque, temple, employer, the medical community, all the resources that are feeding the family. At the macro level, we're talking about government policies and government programs that are adding support to the family. These supports are in addition then to the family's internal and collective resources. Now, we sometimes as social workers need to help the family identify those supports because they, in the midst of crisis, in the midst of stress, they can't see clearly what's right there in front of them. So we may need to help them identify those supports. but they're there in the community and they're there in the family. Each family has all sorts of internal and external social supports that they can draw on. Sometimes we're just not aware of those because we're exhausted, overwhelmed by stress, or whatever. So this is part of our job to help them see those resources. Let's move now to the double C. Now, the double C stands for the family's appraisal. That's their way of making meaning of the situation, of the stressor, of the pileup of demands, right, that they're undergoing. Now, there's two levels of appraisal. The situation appraisal is when they kind of give definition to the demands, the capabilities, their relationships to each other. So they're appraising the situation, but they're also appraising or defining their capabilities. How significant, or what is the potential of our resources? What is the potential of our strengths? What coping strategies do we have that can meet the demands of this stressor? So they're appraising the situation, looking at the situation, defining it as, hugely catastrophic, moderately troubling, a minor stressor, and then they're looking at their capabilities. What do we have as a family, and what do we have in our social world to help us meet the demands of this stressor, strain, transition, right? Okay, in the next slide, we're going to move to the triple C, which, as you'll see, well, let me not get ahead of myself. Move ahead. Here we see the triple C. The triple C is the family's schema. That's their view of their relationship to each other and their view of their relationship to the community. It's their worldview. It's how they see themselves and how they see their world. When a worldview is the world's a hostile place, everybody's out to get me, that's one way that a worldview might negatively impact the appraisal of the stressor, strain, or transition. On the other hand, if the worldview is positive, one worldview is if things are not the way you want them, then wait a minute, and it'll change. And there's another worldview that says everything turns out okay in the end. If everything's not okay, this is not the end. So these are different worldviews, or God's in control, and God will direct all situations so that no weapon formed against us will prosper, right? These are all worldviews that can help the family give definition to their appraisal of the pileup of stressors, strains, and demands. Sometimes their worldview, however, is shattered when things happen, like the death of a child. If you're a spiritual religious family, how can a good God allow this to happen to us? And so it actually stresses out their worldview. A great example of that was the movie Signs, an M. Night Shyamalan movie with Mel Gibson as a priest. His wife dies, and he gives up on the priesthood. People keep calling him father so-and-so, and he says, I'm not a father anymore. Only to realize that his view of the situation was wrong. The crisis that he experienced was incorrect, and then he went back to being a father and reorganized his spiritual worldview. But at one point in the movie, he loses all the things that gave his life meaning, and now is just kind of depressed and really struggling, just exhausted, right? There's 5 dimensions. We're not going to go into those in depth of a family schema or a family worldview, but shared purpose, collectivity or working together, frameability, how we can frame situations differently to see them from different angles, relativism, and shared control. Now, you don't need to know those. Just want you to know that these are elements of a family schema. Okay, next we're going to move to the PSC, or the so the PSC is the family's problem solving as coping, and coping, as we already know. Now, there's a mistake here. While the circle is in the right place, at the upper right, the arrow is going to the wrong place. Picture that arrow going down a little bit to where it says family problem solving, family coping. So picture that arrow going down to, you see where it says family schema, and then beneath that's family resources. And then this, almost square box beneath that says family problem solving and family coping. That's where that arrow should be pointing. So this is the process of acquiring and allocating resources to restore balance between the demands and the resources of the family. So now they need new things, and they need to, they need maybe money, or they need help, or they need, something tangible or something intangible to cope with the pileup. So either a social support or something from within the family is allocated to meet the demand. But sometimes they have to find new resources, right, to meet the needs because they've tapped out all their existing resources. So that's the process of acquiring and then allocating resources to meet the demands. It can be both individual, as we talked about, because all the members of the family individually have resources, but it also can be something that the family does as a whole. We pull together as a whole. We're going to step up. We're going to create some new rules. We're going to create some new roles. We're each going to do different things, but we're going to meet this need. For example, an individual could take a new job. So say the wife has been a homemaker and she decides instead that she's going to go back to work. So she goes back to work, but that means that the oldest daughter now has to do the laundry, and the middle son has to cook the food for the evening meal, and so on and so forth. So there's a shift of individuals, but also a shift of the family to meet the needs of the crisis. Okay, in the next slide, we move to the double X, which is our last piece of this. So let's go there now. Double X is the family's view of adaptation and the possibility of transitioning back into crisis. So either they've kind of got things worked out and the crisis is resolved and now they're ready to move on, or they have to recycle through the entire process again, through the adaptation phase at least, to kind of work through all these pieces and parts until they then resolve the crisis. Or they could reach full exhaustion where they just give up and stop trying. If there's no further crisis, the family is going to move on, right? They're going to adjust. They're going to do fine, and so life will go on. But if there's current crisis and the pileup is too much, they're either going to reach exhaustion or kind of recycle through the process again, kind of re-experiencing the crisis, and more are going to be added onto it until they kind of get it resolved. Okay, in the next slide, what I want to do is put all four of these diagrams together to show you how they work together. So you ready? Let's move on. Okay, so unfortunately my talking head is blocking part of this, but you can go back and look at the previous slide to figure out what it is. So if you look at the top two diagrams, you see where that X is at the very end, or the far right of the adjustment phase, and to the left of the adaptation phase. So the family is working from the A all the way up to the crisis, which doesn't have to happen because they could have bond adjustment, not maladjustment. If they're maladjusted, the crisis continues, and then they move into the adaptation phase. Now at the bottom, you can see how these two phases are very, very, very similar, except for you've got the stressor or the transition, you've got the pileup of demands, you've got the family life cycle stage, and then you kind of move through each of these pieces till you get to adjustment. Either a family adjusts well and they're fine, or they're maladjusted and then they move into crisis. Then you move into the adjustment phase. And you see how each of these pieces leads all the way up to adaptation. They either adapt well, so they make their necessary changes, they bring the right resources, they change their definition, they change their rules, they change their rules, they change their family structure, they do whatever it takes to meet the needs of the crisis and adapt well, or they go into maladaptation, which leads to either exhaustion or recycling through the adjustment phase, or adaptation phase. Once they adapt, they can move back into adjustment, and so they can then fight off further stress. I know this seems complicated. It's really not all that complicated, just these diagrams are so tough to work through. But if you think of the ABCX model and the double ABCX model, what we're seeing is just pieces added to that, right? Lots of things here, but these are stepping stones to what we're going to look at next in Module 8. So with that said, if you haven't taken the midterm exam, you've got until the 18th to take that exam, which falls during this module. So you'll want to get it done by the midnight of the 18th. You got 2 hours to take that exam, so make sure that you don't wait until the last minute. Otherwise, move through the next items in this module till you get to the discussion board. First post on Wednesday, follow-up post to at least 3 classmates by Saturday, and make sure you take the quizzes that go with this lecture and the book and with all the other pieces, and then we'll move to Module 8, and I'll see you on the flip side. Take care, y'all. Peace.